can send out a recording of this session. All right. So thank you all for joining us today as we have a conversation about managing compliance fluidity, focusing on the role of operational compliance. This is one of the webinars in our research compliance series through the Huron Compliance webinar series. So thank you so much. Now we're going to take a moment and we're going to introduce ourselves. And so I am Roseanne Luongo, and I am a manager within Huron's Research Services Department. I've been with Huron for just under 2 years. Prior to that, I worked for 17 years at Harvard University, and I was fortunate to have the opportunity to work with one of our co-panelists today, Tracy Westervelt. So I'll let Tracy introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. I'm Tracy Westervelt. Currently, I work at Harvard University. I've been there for 5 years as their Director of Research Finance. And prior to that, I actually worked at Huron for 8 years, doing a lot of these webinars and traveling around the country, working in sponsored research. And prior to that, I actually spent about 10 years, I started my career through until I went to Huron at Harvard in sponsored research. So I've got over 20 years of experience in sponsored research and compliance, and it's one of my favorite things to talk about. So it should be a fun discussion today.
Yes.
Rochelle?
Yes, hi, my name is Rochelle Kane. I'm an associate within the higher education practice. I've had the privilege to work with Tracy at the beginning of my career once I started Huron, and I'm very excited to host or moderate the webinar with both Tracy and Roseanne today. So let's briefly just kind of walk through the agenda. We've already presented ourselves, but initially we will do a short recap of Q1 and Q2 webinar series, which really sets the foundation for understanding institutional compliance, its structure, and leadership. Next, we will get into the meat and potatoes, or the tofu and potatoes if you're a vegan, of the conversation by discussing an overview of operational compliance and the importance of maintaining fluidity between programmatic and operational compliance. Then we'll run through a few case studies from operational areas, followed by an introduction to the 3 areas of consideration when you think about operational defense. Lastly, we will wrap up the discussion with some time for Q&A. Okay, so let's do a brief recap. In Q1, the discussion started with programmatic versus operational compliance. This was presented by Dr. Tim Fournier from Rutgers, alongside Leah Guidry and Ann Pfeiffer from Huron. They set the stage by talking about institutional compliance, where we encountered the concepts of big C versus little c. Big C, or programmatic compliance, being the overarching framework for the compliance program, directs how we're going to do it, whereas little c, or operational compliance, is more involved with the daily operations of what we're going to do to adhere to institutional policies, procedures, and federal requirements. Now, when we think about establishing a research compliance program, there are 8 elements of effective compliance programs that help ensure proper oversight of these programs, such as an effective compliance leadership, established policies and procedures, regular training, efficient communication across the research community, auditing and monitoring processes, enforcement standards to address noncompliance, guidance to create corrective responses, and clearly defined roles and responsibilities. In the second webinar, Research Compliance Organizational Structure, Achieving Operational Compliance and Managing Risk, was presented by Luana Putney, the Associate Chancellor and Chief Ethics and Compliance Officer at the University of California, Merced, alongside Marissa Zaskar and TJ Eno from Huron. This webinar's focus was on various leadership options to achieve both operational compliance and compliance oversight. In doing so, they discussed these 4 influences institution type, institutional culture, amount and complexity of research portfolio, and institutional risk tolerance, and how these influences all have to be balanced in determining the most appropriate research compliance structure for a particular institution. And lastly, in addition, defining the scope of the program, such as segregating or integrating institutional or research compliance, delineating roles and responsibilities across the operational lines, and developing effective tools are all strong pillars of success for an effective program. At the bottom of the previous 4 slides, you will find a link to both the Q1 and Q2 research webinar series so that you can go back and review the content at your leisure. I think before we begin the discussion of operational compliance, we'd like to gather some of your thoughts. So I'll turn this over to Roseanne.
Great, thank you, Rochelle. So we're going to start off with our first poll question. And so the question is, how well do you feel that your institution has implemented the 8 elements of an effective compliance program? Minimally, moderately, broadly, or unsure? So there's 8 elements. You know, as you reflect on that and as you think through where you think or how you think your institution has fared in this area, it could be maybe that, you know, all 6 out of the 8 you feel have been done really well, and maybe there's a couple areas that you feel need some support or some additional work. I think that's pretty common. I think the other thing to think about as we think about how institutions have implemented effective compliance programs, it's really, I don't know, I think it's a labor of love or a work in process. It's something that folks are continually working on. You know, if my panelists would agree, but is it a one and done situation? You know, it's just continually assessing and evaluating. So as you think through that, and here are our results here. So you know, it looks like we're in pretty good shape where a majority of the folks are in the, you know, moderately or broadly, so that's good. You know, some folks are unsure, and we have some cases of minimally, but as a whole, it sounds as if the, you know, institutions represented in our meeting today have really been able to address the 8 elements of the effective compliance program. So that's good. So thank you. So again, we're going to be focusing today as we go through this session on operational compliance and really what does that mean, and really trying to tease out some of the key roles and responsibilities that operational compliance has, and thinking through what do we need to be able to put in place in an institution to have an effective operational compliance program related to research. So thanks, Rochelle. So the next slide, please. So I think just a key concept that we really, as we were working through this session and thinking through the different examples that we're going to talk about today, really the key between programmatic and operational compliance is consistent communication, making sure that there is really good feedback loops between the two, because they have to work in such close concert to really make sure you have a strong compliance program to start. So having good communication channels, having those channels operate consistently, and also having some checks in place to make sure that they're functioning appropriately. Having some cohesion. Are they aligned with risk tolerance? Are they aligned with the institutional approach and culture? And really what's key, and in the examples that we're talking about today, it's really another key theme that emerged from it is also agility. Making sure that these 2 areas can really respond to one another in, you know, quick timing, as we saw over the last, I think, 6 months, especially in the COVID era, as we were, you know, working through emerging and changing government regulations, but just really thinking through having a very strong partnership between these 2 areas to manage the 1A and the 3 C's here, agility, cohesion, consistency, and communication between the 2. So as we think about this a little bit further, ready for the next slide here, it's thinking about the programmatic compliance, as Rochelle pointed out in our recap, is really helping us think through what is it that we need to do? What's the requirement? What's the regulation? And it's these operational units, and here are some examples that we have in our operational examples, sort of this other circle. As we see, the programmatic and the operational are really connected very strongly. And it's really the research misconduct unit, or the folks responsible for effort reporting, or conflict of interest, or subrecipient monitoring, or managing foreign influence concerns, or HRPP, that are the ones that think through the what needs to be done and really following through on that seamless execution to make sure that we have a strong compliance program and we're minimizing the risk. So when we think about the roles throughout the compliance program, we reflected on this as well, and are some roles squarely in one of these squares or the other, or one of these boxes or the others? In some cases, yes. Typically, you see the chief compliance officer or the research compliance officer in those programmatic type roles. And we would typically see sponsored project leads or individual units or departments within the operational compliance. But depending on the size of the institution, how it's structured, and if I think back to actually the second webinar in the series, it may actually depend on how your institution is structured to determine where these roles fit. And so sometimes the line between the programmatic and operational, you may have roles on either side. Tracy, how do you feel about that, being at an institution and actually in your experience at Huron, seeing many institutions implement this?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I've been doing this for a long time. So when I started at Harvard, being a grant manager back in the early days of my career, I only knew, I didn't know anything about these programmatic roles at the university. I really focused on what do I need to do to manage the sponsored research. Whereas now, the chief compliance officer, research compliance officer, they're very much out there and working very closely with the sponsored programs offices, which is where it should be. And it just took a long time to get there, to realize that there needs to be this cohesion, as you said earlier, between the operational programmatic roles. So I think it's definitely shifted towards that over the past 10 or 15 years, and for the better, because I think we realize we shouldn't be doing this in a vacuum. There's a lot that can get lost, and I think that most universities that I've been, at my time at Huron, visited, recognize that as well.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point, because I think you and I have similar paths in addition to coming to Huron, but starting out in a department as a grants administrator, and you're right, I was also very squarely focused on what I need to do to make this right. And it was only over time that I even recognized that there was this sort of other vantage point or other perspective in thinking through and really setting the stage and the context. So thank you for that. All right, so we're ready to go on to our next section here, where it's our next poll question. And so the next poll question we have is, at your institution, do you feel like operational leaders are well-versed in their compliance responsibilities? As we've determined, it's really a key critical role that we have strong operational leadership to help to implement and really define what we need to do to be able to comply with what the government has required or what the research really needs to be successful. So how are we feeling? Is it absolutely? Do you feel absolutely the compliance leadership strongly understands what they need to do and understands what their compliance responsibilities are, or somewhat, minimally, not at all? Or maybe it depends on the area, and I think that that's a very fair answer as well.
And we should remind folks, Roseanne, that this is anonymous, so that nobody's giving away their institution or writing out.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, so this is all anonymous, so feel free to share. And also, can we play Las Vegas rules in this webinar? It's like what is shared in this webinar stays in this webinar, right? Even though we're sending out a recording.
It is recorded.
Yeah. But in any event, so look, it sounds like good. We're doing really well here. We have a really good group here today. So it sounds like, a majority of folks really feel like their operational leaders are well versed in their compliance responsibilities, which is great. And I think we also want to take a moment to just really underscore how important it is for operational leaders to understand and be, and first of all, be on the same page with programmatic leadership for compliance to determine, what it is we need to do and how we have to do it, and be in line with being able to execute, and also clearly communicate that to the folks that work with them to be able to execute this mission. I know that, as Tracy had mentioned before, really thinking through, whose responsibility is compliance. And the answer that I love to hear and love to share is it's really everybody. Everybody plays such a key role, no matter, whatever you're doing managing research. All of these tasks are critical and important as we go through. Otherwise, the question is, why are we doing them? So this is a really important message, I think, to be able to share at the institution. So I don't know if Rochelle or Tracy, you have any other opinions on that, or how you feel about, how are we making sure that folks across the entity are aware of what they need to do?
Yeah, that's a challenge, I think, especially at Harvard, where we're so decentralized, making sure that we do have a good training program. We have gone to doing snippets of training, so maybe 10 minutes of a webinar or something, and so you don't need to sit there for an entire hour to go to a training to learn about cost transfers, for example. So I think we've gone to short and sweet, and people can kind of do it at their leisure, or when they need it, they can go in and don't have to spend an hour trying to figure out, just maybe they have one or two questions. So I think we've kind of tried to do that to get people well versed. But I think it's hard because, we're a large university, we have different schools, and they do have different business processes across the different schools. So sort of who owns that has always been kind of a discussion, and trying to wrangle it all in has been challenging.
I would agree. I think for the institutions that I've worked with, I think communication is key, making sure that everyone understands the requirements and who they're reporting to. I think also, if you go back to the 8 elements, ensuring that everyone understands their roles and responsibilities and how to actually perform them, along with training like Tracy referred to. I think those things are pretty key points.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I think in addition to training, that's certainly a piece of it. And Tracy, I love that it's the short snippets, because it's this, YouTube quick hit era that we're in. And, it's also on-demand training. So you want to hear that when you need it. And I think also when folks are looking at their policies, or when institutions are reviewing and evaluating them, making sure that who the policy applies to and what folks need to do, perhaps not addressed specifically in the policy, but even in those companion policies and procedures. And so, we say that those are great things to have in place, but certainly in this area of operational compliance, how important it is to really have all of that very clear and crisp, with education, updated policies and procedures, and having those roles and responsibilities as crisp as possible. All right. Then we can go on to the next. So now we're going to talk about some operational compliance areas.
Yes, and this is the fun part of our webinar, I think, in terms of really open discussion about the fluidity between the programmatic and operational compliance. And certainly feel free, if folks have questions or want to chime in here, that would be great to hear from you. Our first category is actually foreign influence. And I think in thinking about being agile, I think, a year ago, 6 months ago, we were all, actually probably a year ago now, we were all very agile in terms of, oh no, the foreign influence is a big thing. People are being investigated. Universities were getting letters from OIG. And then all of a sudden COVID hit, and we were like pulled in this direction. They did not forget about foreign influence, as you all are aware, but it did pull us into a different direction, sort of, okay, now what do we do with COVID? How do we deal with this? We're now sort of getting back to our foreign influence, and we did a lot of training on this at Harvard. But what's at risk? I mean, this is a big one. This is really where at Harvard, we really came together, the Sponsored Research Office and our OVPR, Vice Provost for Research, on making sure that we got out there with the training and understanding what this meant to our investigators. So there is both training that has to happen for the investigators, but there's also training that has to happen for the people who work in the department that are doing other support. I think what we found in this area in particular, that there's outside activities, there's FCOI, and there's other support, and there was nobody necessarily connecting the dots. So this is where that fluidity needs to really be in place in order to make sure that you are low risk for being the next letter from OIG on foreign influence and what's happening. I'm sure you're aware at Harvard, we did have somebody arrested and charged. And so that's sort of still ongoing. So we're really taking this seriously and working very closely with our OVPR. For managing the risk on that, anything you want to say, Roseanne, on what that risk?
I was just, well, actually, I was kind of reflecting on the operational units as you talked about them. And this area in particular, I think, is just so complex and so rich in that it's not just one operational unit squarely responsible for a discrete compliance area. And I think that that's what makes foreign influence and the risks so high and so complex, is because we have several operational units, and you just mentioned a couple of them, right? We have the COI folks, we have folks looking at conflicts of commitment, we have department administrators looking at other support and things that would typically just be the normal part of a progress report, and really having all of those areas converge. Also travel, also exports, other things. And I think in this case in particular, it's also the question, how are we weaving a cohesive thread between the different operational units who have to manage that? And that's what I think makes the risk really high. I think you talked about the risk a little bit. Certainly there's the risk of, an arrest. There's an arrest of fines, penalties, payback, and also reputational risk. What other kind of risks are you thinking that are out there with this area?
I think the loss of funding, the loss of integrity to the university. And I think for the person in particular at Harvard who ended up being arrested, there was a lab there, there were graduate students there, there were postdocs there. And so the trickle down effect of the foreign influence goes beyond just the faculty member who might have engaged in something illegal. It goes beyond that. And I think that's what we're seeing, and trying to minimize the impact to the students who, it's not their fault, had nothing to do with it. I also think, it's good to know that this is something that isn't new, right? So there's just renewed focus on this. And I think now, before, if you made a mistake on your other support, it was just considered, maybe it was a mistake and you forgot to include that. Now it's not. There's severe penalties. And so I feel for people who work in the department, the grant managers who are reviewing this, and the pre-award officers who are also reviewing it, and signing off on this to submit to a sponsoring agency saying that, yes, this is accurate. We only know what we know. And I think that probably is in the back of people's minds as they're thinking about this, and how do we connect the dots, and, being more transparent across the university in terms of what does COI or the FCOI look like. And so I think we're getting there. We're not there yet, but we're certainly working towards that level of transparency where people feel comfortable signing and submitting proposals with other support. And providing the right materials and training for the schools. So we're working now on getting everything up on the website now that we have the NSF, other support, guidance, and NIH, and just trying to understand it, right? Because there's some gray area in there. So we're really trying to interpret, understand, and making sure that we're thinking about the same way as our colleagues across the country. So I know COGR is very involved in this, FDP is. So there's a lot of communication happening on that front. So as much cohesion there is in the university and communication, there is outside of Harvard with other universities as well, which I think is really important.
No, I agree with you. I think in terms of risk assessment, as we're evaluating the risk, certainly looking internally and trying to quantify it or determine the materiality of it there, but you have to also look externally, what's happening in other places. And I think that's, especially in this area, as we're seeing news articles come out some weeks almost daily, it's really something to keep up with and try to understand. Again, when you're thinking through how you're going to manage or assign responsibilities to these operational units, this is really a key question. And no two solutions might work out. You might have different solutions at different institutions. And so thinking through at a highly decentralized place like Harvard, what might work versus if you had a centralized unit. Maybe you have the PIs primarily at the center of it, really working on all these things. Maybe we have department administrators, or maybe we try to take it on centrally within a sponsored office. And so thinking through the risk tolerance, thinking through the different factors of how you're structured to try to, again, think about how we bring all these folks together. And so the question of how does this relate to programmatic compliance, Tracy, is it fair to say that programmatically, it's really at the institution folks who are scanning the external environment, figuring out what those key risks are, identifying what is necessary, what's required, because I know even 18 months ago, I think across the country, it was a question of what do we need to do? And as you mentioned, it was a reminder of what was needed. And so thinking through that, and even in the example of the Department of Education reporting, right? That was clearly a reminder. Wasn't anything new there, but you know, just really setting that stage of, okay, here's what we need to do, and let's figure out how to do it.
I agree. You know, I think this example in particular really crosses the domains in programmatic and operational. And I think we need support from our Vice Provost for Research and really to get out there to the faculty, because there is some ownership there, and want to make sure that the faculty were aware and understood the risk. A lot of these things, we know, go right to the departments and we kind of stay with them and figure them out, and how do we operationalize this? This one really had to be driven from our OVPR, and it has been. And in fact, all the documentation we're doing, we're putting up on their website, but we're all involved. From all the sponsored research offices are involved, our COI offices, and our OVPR. But it's going to be owned and operated by our Vice Provost for Research. So I think this is really a good example of that synergy.
Yeah, no, I do. I think it is a good example of it. And actually, one point you just raised in terms of the support needed. So if we have the operational and programmatic on the same page, then hopefully we're getting the institutional support needed to address something. All right, no, good. So thank you for that. We're gonna, I think, move on to our next section. But I mean, we could talk about this one all stuff, foreign influence all day. It's exciting, and you know, and our newest area. But subrecipient monitoring is something that is equally, right? We're equally passionate about that, right, Tracy?
Oh, subrecipient monitoring. So yeah, this is
it's not new.
This
though,
is a
right?
great one.
Nothing. Yeah,
not new. Yeah, it's been around for a while. Yeah. So the subrecipient monitoring, I think what I found when I came back to Harvard and sort of was handed subrecipient monitoring, I was like, okay, is that nobody actually really owns this anywhere. There's like this little ownership across the country. So as I speak about this, and I've done many sessions on this at Ankara, people will be like, well, nobody really owns subrecipient monitoring. And so how do you operationalize that at your university? And you know, when I came in, Harvard had a finding. And so as a result of that finding, we sort of went like 110 degrees in terms of like what we did. And we scaled it back a little bit. But it is something that this is one area that is managed across the university. It is, you know, I run a university-wide subrecipient monitoring committee. And then each school has a committee, and we meet quarterly, and then I send out reports, and they have to respond back on what they do. So this is one where there's no one owner of this, this process and policy, and we do have a policy on it, but multiple. And I think what we found out what's at risk is a finding. You can get a finding on this. I also think in terms of the foreign influence, I mean, that if you're subbing out and then there's a foreign component to it, you have to make sure that you're compliant with that. Now with COVID, there's some questions about, oh, are there COVID expenses on there? So I think there's a lot when you think about subrecipient monitoring that has to happen. And the federal government basically telling us that we own the risk to who we sub to. And so I think that in and of itself makes us much more responsible in terms of assessing the sub-organizations to see if we want to sub with them. Yeah. What do you want to add, Roseanne?
Yeah, no, I think that, you know, interesting, as you said, you know, what's at risk? Well, I think clearly, first and foremost, you said, you know, who owns that risk? You know, it's really the government has said, you are owning this relationship with the sub and the management and the oversight. And so making that really clear. And you know, I think the other thing that's at risk here, in addition to what you'd mentioned, is the relationships between the subrecipients, or between the pass-through entity and the subrecipient, and those are valued research relationships. And so trying to strike that balance between meeting the compliance requirements, but at the same time, letting that research flow and letting those relationships and collaborations flourish. And so I think it's a really interesting point that you mentioned. And also, this is another example similar to foreign influence in that the operational unit or the responsibilities seem to be floating across multiple operational units. And so if we think about who those operational units are, the pre-award in some cases, right? I think in most cases are playing a role. The PI is, certainly playing a role in that oversight and making sure programmatic progress occurs. And the departments really, I think, supporting the PIs to, make sure, and really also communicating, I think, I don't know if you agree with this, Tracy, but communicating that to somebody within the institution to say, I'm having an issue, or to communicate, whether or not there's a need for perhaps additional terms or greater oversight. I feel like in my experience looking at subrecipient monitoring, we could have 50 different subs with the same institution, but if we're having issues with one, with one of those 50, we're likely having some issues with a few others. And so it's really that communication across departments and across central to coordinate that to help address that.
Yeah, and we have done that. I mean, as you know, Roseanne, you were with us for some time. We have a quarterly meeting, and everybody brings issues they have, and we sort of see if it's a cross-school, cross-department issue. So if it's just one, is it related to the PI or is it related to the organization? Because remember, the assessments we do are organizational, not necessarily PI specific. So we try to remember that as we're assessing our organizations. But yeah, it's quite a bit of work, and I think I've heard that across the country in terms of just thinking about how do we do this, how do we implement something. We built a system in our system to help us manage all of this and manage the assessment process, because assessments need to be done on some regular basis. And we now have a really good process in place. We have a good policy in place. We outline who needs to do what. Part of our finding in FY14 was people didn't know what their role was in subrecipient monitoring. So we really had to make that clear and get out there and do a lot of trainings. And so we did that over the past few years. And so now I feel like we're in a great place, but it's ever evolving.
Yeah, and one thing, just because I know that FY14 finding very well, but also the documentation of it. I mean, this isn't a session on audit compliance and documentation, but just making sure that it's clear who retains the information. So going back to assigning an operational unit to be able to do that. And how does this relate to programmatic compliance? I think it really goes back to the conversation that we've been having. It's really programmatic and operational being on the same page with what is it that we need to do? What's the objective? What are we trying to accomplish here? And so the objective here is to document the oversight and the risk assessments related to these subs, and then reacting appropriately. And so it's really all of those units that we talked about to try to, help essentially just implement that and really manage that well. And I think also, as we think about this, the process for how are we measuring whether or not, and we're going to be talking about this, I think, a little bit farther along in our closing section on monitoring, but I think programmatic also plays somewhat of a role in the oversight of the operation. Is it functioning as we've intended it to?
Yep, I would agree with that. And the PI actually has a big ownership on this in terms of making sure we do have them sign up on invoices, I think, as most places do, to make sure that the spend is in line with the work being done. And we are asked, what conversations do the PIs have, the pass-through entity and the sub, and making sure that, you just don't give a sub money and say, go do it, and never check in with them. And so there is a lot of ownership there in the PI, and we really try to make sure that that does happen.
Yeah, no, and back to education, making sure that everybody understands what it is they're supposed to be doing. All right, so again, this is another topic. We could talk about subrecipient monitoring for a solid half a day, no? Okay. Yeah. So I guess Tracy and I are really exciting people, and we can talk about our inner sort of nerds are coming out with this, but that's fine. I'm into it. But now we're going to talk about effort reporting a little bit, and this area in particular. It's been pretty interesting the last 6 months, hasn't it been, Tracy? Has there been new stuff coming out about how to manage effort reporting?
Oh, effort reporting. I'm so glad I don't really have to deal with it too much at Harvard. We do have someone else who deals with it more than I do, but commitments and efforts and payroll, like all of it, there's just so much that goes into this. And I think this is definitely an area that's ever evolving as well. I will say, I remember my time way back when at Harvard when I started as a grant manager, and I remember I actually used to sign off on the effort reports for my faculty, not thinking anything of it. Like, they would just come to me every month and I would sign them, until one day, and I'm sure many of you know Cynthia Walker, who's now at Yale but was the CFO at Harvard, she came to a meeting and talked about effort reporting and how some administrator had been arrested for signing off on false effort reports. And so at that point, I was like, oh my God, there's like an impact here. Like this could really impact me. From then on, I never signed another effort report. But it goes back to like, I was working in a department, I was a grant manager, and there wasn't this, I don't feel like this was this communication and cohesion, and I just did, what I was asked to do and told to do, and I signed off on effort reports. I think it's such a different world today where there is nobody in the department signing off on an effort report unless you are part of a big program project grant and you're deemed the one who has the knowledge of who's working on it, and there's things in place to say that. But this is a huge risk area, I think, and I think because it's ever evolving and people are doing different things across the country, it's a tough one, I think. What do you think, Roseanne?
Yeah, no, I think, the risks here, yes, I agree that across the country it's managed in different ways, and actually, and since the uniform guidance came out, we also had a slightly different way to look at this. So in addition to effort reporting, we may have payroll certification, which a number of institutions do as well. So thinking about that. But what's at its core at risk is we could have a payback scenario. And when I think about effort and I think about the risks associated with it, let's just say we take off salary for the faculty member. We got effort, we didn't get it right, and we have to take it off for the faculty member and 3 key researchers on that project. Then we should also be taking off the travel associated with them. Assuming people are traveling again in the world at some point, you would take off the travel. And in addition to that, we'd obviously be taking off the fringe if we had any sort of issue related to it, any supplies that they may have directed a purchase for their work and equipment they may have directed to purchase. And so the way I see it is it's almost like, it's a thread that you keep pulling, and we're just pulling away at everything that we've been able to charge to an award, even the indirect costs. And so the risks can be pretty high. And I think effort reporting findings, if you are also of the camp that for fun, maybe you read OIG reports or audit reports or work plans, effort reporting is something that's been one of those timeless classics. It doesn't seem to go away. It's been there for a very long time. And the risk is, I think, the financial risk in particular, and also the reputational risk is pretty high because salaries are typically one of the largest budget items on any of these projects. So it's definitely an area to pay attention to. And so, how are the risks managed? I think let's use the example maybe even of COVID recently. So what we had was, and this is will also help to illustrate for us the fluidity between programmatic and operational compliance. So as COVID hit in the spring, the OMB was gracious enough to assign a number of flexibilities, and the agency soon followed with updated regulation and updated guidance to help institutions identify ways to be more flexible in managing the unique constraints or challenges that COVID placed on research. And so institutions had a number of different ways to manage this. In some cases, institutions made a decision that if they were paying all staff across the institution, they would continue to pay their research staff in a similar way. In other cases, there were unique leave codes that were implemented to identify COVID-related leave. And in other cases, institutions may have a salary reduction. So just to use that as an example, they're managing the risks in different ways, but the programmatic compliance team really needed to be on point to understand changes were coming through pretty rapidly. And I think if I reflect back that long ago, it was pretty fast, it was pretty furious, it was a scramble to figure out what is it that we need to do, and then really remember those chains of communication and that fluidity and really this great agility to be able to implement those changes pretty quickly. And so I don't know if Tracy, if you have any experience with that or thoughts about what that process was like for you working at an institution.
Yeah, I mean, we went back and forth and had discussions on what those memos that came out after COVID meant and what we should do and the flexibilities. And although, again, everything, it sounds great, but implementing it is a whole nother, a whole nother scenario. So we, at Harvard, and I think a lot of places continue to pay everybody while they were not working. And so we did just do an updated statement on our effort reporting. So where that falls, I mean, we haven't gone through an audit yet, so we'll see how it goes next year when we go through an audit. But, you know, it's just another thing where you have to be agile and you get thrown into this and you're like, well, how are we going to deal with this? I think the one thing we're really, you know, and this goes back to, I think the last session you all did talking about the type of institution you are, the culture at your institution. You know, there's 9-month faculty, there's 12-month faculty, you know, there's a lot of different factors that go into effort reporting and how you do it. There's minimum % of effort that you need to put on a project. And so what all of that means for you at a university sort of will help think about where you're most at risk and making sure you're documenting that and what that looks like for your university. I think that has happened where people don't document it and people think, well, 0% or 1% or 0.5% is okay to put on awards, but that may not be the case for your institution. So I think there is a lot of risk in here, and then we won't even talk about commitments, but effort commitments versus effort reporting is a whole nother area to think about. I think again, the cohesion between the sponsored research office, our OVPR office, and the departments really has to come together for effort reporting. Everyone has a role in this and plays a role in this, and that has helped in terms, you know, we have not had any findings in a long time for effort reporting, right, Roseanne? And we at Harvard. And so we hope to keep it that way,
not on the uniform guidance audit. Yes, certainly.
But across the country, there's been a lot. Yeah.
So Roseanne and Tracy, I'm sorry. We have 2 questions that came in. Would you like to answer the 2 questions pertaining to effort reporting? Is that okay?
Yeah, we could. Yeah.
Okay. So one of the questions is, how are institutions using alternative methods to effort reporting, salary confirmation, handling COVID-related compensated time? What effort expended is reduced?
Sure. So I think to answer this question, and I can also catch up with folks offline if I don't address it now, but I think the alternative methods were, as we mentioned, it's, you know, if your institution was making a decision to pay the, you know, staff, faculty continuously, and that was a choice, it was important to include that in a policy and make sure that that was the institutional approach. So having consistency, if we go back to, you know, allowable, allocable, consistent, reasonable, it was reasonable to do so and you consistently did that. So that was one way. In other cases, there were specific, paid time off codes used to be able to capture that. I know that some institutions put in a number of COVID related days and just included that in as, you know, similar to ways in which they would handle vacation or sick or other time. And then another way was, you know, some institutions made a choice. They said, you know, we will be unable to across the board pay folks, so we will do a, you know, salary reduction. So I don't know if Tracy, you would add anything else to that.
No, I think that covered it. I mean, we did have a policy and made sure we had a policy because that was part of the memo to continue to pay people, and it had to be consistent across the university, which it was. And then we did add sort of an attestation to our effort reporting that stated that. And we did track at Harvard how many projects were impacted where people were not working at all. And it was much less than what I thought it would be, which was good. But I think that's sort of how we handled it.
Yeah, no, and I think actually, I'm familiar with, I think, also the way in which you sort of did, where you said to the PIs, tell me your plan, right? Help us figure out. And so to me, that's also a way, like at a programmatic approach, we're going to continue to, you know, to pay, but we need the researchers to have a plan in place. So that's what we're going to do. And then really sort of leaning on departments and PIs to step up and say, what's your plan? Here's the criteria, and then you need to fill that and move forward. So I think that that's also a really great example of the exchange between the fluidity and the operational, and really the operational arm being the implementation partner, if you will. And then we have another quick question, you know, can we recommend any guidance or resources for dealing with physician investigators and salary caps? So with physician investigators, you know, there's a number of different commitments on their time and different levels. And so, you know, there's the NIH salary cap. I think Corey has a cap, other institutions, I think, HRSA has a cap. And so, it's really being able to track salary up to the cap, and of course, only charging effort up to the cap, or having the cap be the base and then a rate based on the effort, and then being able to track not only the direct salary, but the amount charged in and above the cap. All right, so I think we're going to move on to the next section. We're going to go over human subjects research quickly, and then we're going to get into our closing section on focusing on really how operational compliance addresses monitoring and management of those risks.
Yeah.
Right.
So in order to extend the conversation about the impact of COVID on operational functions, one of the areas that it impacted was how institutions actually conducted human subjects research. So if you're thinking about a university or a hospital and they're conducting human subjects research, everything is sort of kind of in-house. You're doing your consenting of your subjects, you're enrolling your subjects, your research visits are conducted all in-house. But all of a sudden, you have this impact of COVID where you had to consider safety measures as far as like PPE and 6 feet of distancing. So how were institutions really handling and adjusting to that type of impact, right? So a lot of the things that they were trying to mitigate were outside of research, how to not put subjects at risk because you didn't want them to have exposure, but also how do we still safely conduct the research? How do we assess patients' adverse events during the study visits? So institutions really had to think about changing their daily operations. So some institutions decided to totally shut down. I think they probably thought that that was the safest method, but other institutions decided to, let's say, as far as like the consenting process, instead of it being personal, they did it remotely. Instead of conducting study visits in-house, they used a remote laboratory facility to conduct the study visit. So those were the adjustments that a lot of universities and hospitals and healthcare systems had to really consider when COVID hit all of a sudden. They didn't have the appropriate amount of time to kind of plan and really adjust their functions the way that they really wanted to.
Yeah, no, I think that's, just another prime example of how we have rapid change coming through, we have regulatory shifts, and that cohesion and that agility between these two groups so that the operational units can just pick it up and run with it and implement whatever we need to do. So in these cases of COVID regulatory change, we saw a loosening of the regulation a bit to be able to accommodate the ease of this. In other instances, we have seen tightening, or we've seen more stringent compliance. And so I guess we have to say, it has to be able to go both ways. I think maybe an example of that is ARA, the American Reinvestment and Recovery Act. We saw additional terms and conditions, additional regulations, and, operational units really needed to be able to adapt really quickly and come up with a plan, and really having programmatic compliance also be able to oversee and approve and, give their opinion and provide their opinion on that. But actually, of the 4 areas we've looked at so far, what's at risk? In this case, the risks are so high because these are obviously safety of humans, and so we want to make sure that that's the utmost priority, right? As scary as the other things may seem, this, I think is the scariest. So then the most high risk. So that's it. No, I appreciate that. You think we're ready to move on to our last and final section? We're good?
Yes.
All right. So just to recap, as so we talked about the importance of communication between the two, making sure you have this channel of communication well defined, and also I would recommend you test that they're functioning. I don't know, Tracy, if you recall, but I feel like there's been cases where we thought things were communicated back and forth in some instances, and sometimes they weren't. And so really sort of testing those channels, making sure it's flowing. Making sure you have the right information, and that's where actually metrics can play a huge role. Having data, having metrics so that you can evaluate whether or not something is effective, whether or not something is consistently happening. I know another example is cost transfers. I know, Tracy, we worked on a cost transfer project a couple of years ago, and really, did we have good data flowing through in each area? Did we, do we have the data? And that was very critical in evaluating the risks and really evaluating whether or not something was functioning effectively. So I think we can't underscore enough how critical data is. And also the cohesion between the programmatic, as we talked about, and operational compliance, and then that agility to be able to move on a dime if needed. And so now we're going to go into our final poll question, our poll question number 3. Which areas within your institution's research compliance infrastructure do you think is effectively balancing the operational and programmatic compliance balance? Have you hit that sweet spot in which of these areas? And so, as we talked about, foreign influence and subrecipient monitoring, asset reporting, and human subjects, there could be other areas that you may want to raise as well. And so, just give us a sense of where you think you are in each of these areas. Each of these areas poses its own unique risks, but I think we also have some consistent themes that we're able to identify across, being that we might have more than one operational unit really responsible for meeting the objectives or the compliance objectives in each one of them, the importance of the PI and the research team really participating in that, and then making sure we have good data, good information and communication to make sure that we can evaluate whether or not the area is functioning as intended. So let's see where we are with these results and see how folks feel about it. And so, oh wow, so it looks like a good amount of folks are feeling within the human subjects area that there is a nice balance between operational and programmatic compliance. And I feel like, so foreign influence is the lowest area where we feel like there's a balance. And I think that makes sense. I don't know, Rochelle, Tracy, how you feel about it, because it's probably one of the more emerging areas. That makes sense.
It's new and then kind of got bumped by COVID, right? So people are probably taking a hiatus from foreign influence.
I agree.
Yeah, but we gotta jump back on that one. And the effort. So we talked about effort reporting being probably it's a significant area. It's pretty material based on the dollar value, and subrecipient monitoring, just so many moving pieces. So critical areas, and maybe these are ideas for sort of future sessions talking about the operational compliance specific to these. So I appreciate that. All right, so let's go on to the last section. Thank you. All right, so now we're going to talk about the 3 areas of consideration to think about when we think about operational defense. And so we start off by thinking about, I'm ready for the next slide here. So years ago, a dear colleague of mine who worked in internal audit shared a white paper from the Institute of Internal Auditors. And in this 3 lines of defense, and the link is at the bottom here. If you Google it, you'll find it. It may change your life like it's changed mine. I know, Tracy, you've read it as well, and I think you're a fan. But really what it helps us to understand is that you need to have these cohesion between different lines of defense, especially in terms of monitoring and risk mitigation coordination, as we were talking about throughout this whole balance between operational and programmatic compliance, and also having those clearly delegated roles, as we talked about, with clear roles and responsibilities. And so the results of not having these things coordinated or cohesive can be that we've overlooked something, and it may actually result in a significant finding for not having it managed. Okay, next slide, please. So operational management, as this white paper describes it, is really the key group that is responsible for owning and managing those risks. These units are most familiar, as we've talked about, within effort reporting, subrecipient monitoring, human subjects research, and foreign influence. It's those folks who are really facing this on a day-to-day basis and are most intimately familiar with it. And so therefore, we'll be able to quickly or more easily identify issues as they arise and be able to manage them, and also be able to put in place an amended process or perhaps a corrective action to be able to address it, and on a daily basis be responsible for managing effective internal controls. All right, and so The second line of defense is perhaps, I don't know, the way I think about it, I'm curious to hear what you all think. It's, you know, I think this is where programmatic compliance maybe steps in and really helps us to figure out compliance with laws, compliance with regulations, that what we're supposed to be doing. And then also helping to determine the institutional risk tolerance so that we have a good risk framework to be able to implement and work through the what needs to be done within the operational compliance. And also, I think, actually, as we were talking about, and as Tracy, you had mentioned, it's really that group is key with trying to identify what's going on across the industry, what sort of emerging issues have we identified, and perhaps through the risk assessment process, identifying other issues that may not have been on folks' radar. But I think that those issues are also identified at the operational level and communicated up.
I will say, Roseanne, we didn't mention risk management and audit services throughout, but we have a good relationship with our risk management group at Harvard, and I would advise other universities to do the same because it is important to know what is happening and what findings they might have with departments at your university. So I think that relationship has worked really well, and I would definitely advise on, if you don't have one, to build that relationship because they're another office that we deal with quite a bit.
No, that's really key. And I think engaging them and having them work in concert with the programmatic compliance teams is critical. All right, thank you. So the next slide, please. So, and then we get to internal audit. Now, in some cases, risk management and internal audit may be together, but internal audit, ideally with these three lines of defense that we just reviewed, the risks and the challenges in any instances of non-compliance will be identified within the institution, so that you wouldn't have to have it found by an outside party, an auditor, or regulator. Ideally, these three core lines functioning in a fluid, agile way to be able to manage institutional risks and to be able to manage compliance requirements, you know, helps us to make sure we have a strong, effective program where we can internally manage and be able to assess risks. And so the internal audit can, you know, will be able to opine on the effectiveness of a program, be able to advise management and governing boards, perhaps getting support of those folks to be, so that the programmatic and operational folks get the resources needed to be able to manage these, and then also, you know, make sure that there's reliability and integrity for this work. So with that, I see that we have one final question. We have a few moments for additional questions if you'd like, but Rochelle, if you can go to the next slide, please. So if you have any questions, you can certainly reach out to one of us. But we also have some upcoming sessions, and we have some upcoming. So we have our research compliance podcast series. So if you're interested in that, we have information on it. It's found out on the SoundCloud, and it's also on the Huron website. We have a research compliance resource library that has a number of our different thought leadership pieces that you can go visit. Actually, the COVID resources for human research subjects protection and effort and our grants management pieces are there as well. And we have some foreign influence pieces already out there, but we're also going to have a number of pieces coming out very shortly, so please stay tuned for those. So in closing, I want to say thank you very much to you, Tracy, and thank you very much to Rochelle for joining us today. Thank you, all of you, for joining us today. I want to thank you and let us know if you have any additional questions. We'd be happy to answer them. I think we have one final one here. Do you have data on efficacy of resources, staffing, and ratio to volume of work required to be able to implement an effective compliance and operational program? And so we do, that's actually one thing that we do. We help institutions to figure out what the right mix of operational and programmatic compliance staff are, and we have a number of benchmarking resources as well. So we do have some information on that, but we can certainly follow up and give you more information on that. So in closing, I just want to say again, thank you so much. Thank you to all for joining us. Thanks to the team putting this together. Thank you, Tracy, and have a great rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.